It is that time now once again, for getting lumped up with my friends. It's RockerMike and Rob that you should know, and you'll find them here on the Rockshow. Ooh, yeah, on the Rockshow.
Okay, everybody, welcome to another RockerMike and Rob show, the Rock Show. Yes, episode, sir. Which one? 142?
This is 142, and we're talking about who the hell Hüsker, you said it.
Hüsker Dü. Hüsker Dü. Hüsker Dü. You know, they were a punk band out of St. Paul, Minneapolis area in Minnesota. Very popular.
Quick question: what does the name mean?
Remember, there used to be a game called Hüsker Dü. It means do you remember?
Do you know what? I didn't remember that.
When we were kids, there was a game called Hüsker Dü. Oh God, I wish I can remember what the theme of it was. It meant it was like a memory game. You had to remember where stuff was and stuff. And I get into how they got the name, but they took that name and then they added the dots above the U's to make it look a little, different. So that's how they did that. But, Hüsker Dü was very influential to what came later, stuff that would be considered the alternative music scene in the early 90s. I don't think would have been too possible without Hüsker Dü. They were kind of like on that line of mainstream and underground. They skirted that for a long time. Never quite broke. Probably about 10 years ahead of their time. They would have been able to break probably in the 90s, but they did. They just were a little bit ahead of themselves. I think like there used to be an expression called college rock. And college rock was bands like REM and stuff like that in the 80s. But Hüsker Dü were kind of like in that mold as well. Very popular on college radio stations. That was a thing in the 80s, college radio stations, playing different kinds of music, deeper cuts and stuff that you wouldn't hear on the radio. When alternative music became a thing in the 90s, we all started to get all different kinds of music on the radio. Stuff that would never been played 10 years earlier was getting on the radio, was popular. And Hüsker Dü kind of was gone already by that point. But
did they ever make it to 120 minutes? Did they have like videos and stuff like that?
Yeah. They had videos. They had videos, a few that were popular. They made it onto the 120 minutes or regular MTV rotation. Okay. But they weren't, they weren't huge. They weren't huge. But as far as underground bands go,
they were pretty popular. The Meat Puppets and stuff like that. They were probably adults.
Yeah, they were as big as that, if not bigger. I mean, I think that their popularity most likely existed more in the Midwest and the West Coast than it did in the East Coast. But I was a fan. I knew a lot of people that liked Hüsker Dü in New York. It just was, and I did get to see them one time, and they were pretty good. Yeah.
I gotta tell you, I had no idea who the fuck these guys are. I haven't heard it, so I had no clue who they were until you told me. I saw on the list that I heard one or two songs, and I don't remember, but it's interesting how they had that big love for the Ramones. That's what they united.
Oh, yeah. Right? That's how they got started. And you can hear the Ramones in their music.
Oh yeah.
Especially when they got a little more melodic after the first album, second album. You could hear it. But they were doing something totally original, even with that influence. So let's get into it because it's cool. And one thing I want to point out is, unlike so many bands we cover, this band stayed the same the whole time.
Yeah.
And they had no lineup changes at all. only in the very beginning, but before they had anything out. But as far as you know, they were a power trio the whole time.
Hold on, let's see. Can you hear this?
No. Makes no sense at all. Yeah, great song. You know, and Bob Mould's voice was very recognizable.
Which was the other song? I got "Don't Want to Know If You Are Lonely."
Right. Yeah. And they made an album called Zen Arcade, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, that's like that was like a breakthrough album, right?
It was a breakthrough album. It was a bit of a concept album. It was a double album. It was something that punk bands, you know, in the hardcore theme were not doing. You know,
No.
They weren't getting that deep into stuff. And Hüsker Dü would lose fans over that, but they didn't care. They didn't care. They did what they wanted to do, and I think that's great. You know, when they had complete creativity, pretty much for their whole career, which is a hard thing to have. And they definitely
there so many different record labels. Because damn, for a 10-year run, there were so many record labels, and I do love the story that they were rehearsing Psycho Killer. They just do whatever because they.
Well, that's how they. Yeah, I'll get into that in a minute. That's how they got the name. Now, they basically. Yeah, it is funny. I mean, they just were throwing words out there, and somebody said Hüsker Dü. So they were an American punk band, and they were formed in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1979. Now, the band's 3 members were Bob Mould on guitar and vocals. They had bassist and vocalist Greg Norton and drummer vocalist Grant Hart. Originally,
power trio almost, right?
Exactly. 3 guys, power trio. Originally, the band was called Buddy and the Returnables, and they had a keyboardist with them named Charlie Pine. At that time, Mould was a freshman at Macalester College and frequented a St. Paul record store named Cheapo Records. Grant Hart was already a worker at the store, and Greg Norton would also work there eventually. Hart and Mould would bond in their friendship over their love for the Ramones, and when they wanted to put a band together, they asked Hart and Pine to join. They played mostly cover songs. Some were classic rock songs. They would do a lot of Ramones songs, things like that. Now, unbeknownst to Charlie Pine, the keyboard player, the rest of the band kind of started to not like the keyboard sound in the music. They wanted to get rid of that. And it took them a little time. They kind of were a little, it looked like they did a little bit behind his back. Whatever reason that was, I'm not sure.
They were hesitant to kick him out of the band.
I have a feel that's what it was. They were hesitant to do it. They were probably all friends, you know, but they started practicing without Charlie Pine and just as a trio, and began to write originals as well. Now, one thing that would change immediately would be the band's name. Okay, it kind of all fell into place when they were doing one of these practice sessions. They were trying to do a version of the Talking Heads' Psycho Killer. And there's that part where David Byrne sings in French. He says, "Qu'est-ce que c'est, qu'est-ce que c'est," and they couldn't. They forgot how that went, and they just started throwing words out there of anything they could think of that was like foreign sounding. So somebody, I don't even think they know who it was, yelled out "Hüsker Dü," and it was like "Hüsker Dü." Okay, it sounds good. So they ended up using that as the name. Now, Hüsker Dü was a game that kids played. It was like a memory game. So everybody kind of knew who it was. I'm surprised they never got in trouble for using the name, but it's a good thing they did.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah, they're saying it was a popular 1970 board game.
Yeah,
The phrase
yeah.
without meaning, do you remember, in Dutch and Norwegian?
Right. Now, I'll be honest with you, I might have played that game once or twice in my life. It wasn't anything that I played,
I
but
have
I
no
remember
idea
it being
what
around. I remember it being around, but I would never. It was probably too hard. I think it was kind of more of a adult game in a way. Maybe I'm not sure. But now they liked the name, so what they did is they took the title Hüsker Dü, 2 words, and they put the dots that are called what are they called? They're called umlauts. Umlauts. They're very common in the German language. My Motorhead had the dots above their O.
Can you see that?
There you go.
That's,
It's still around today, right? Hüsker Dü.
I don't know, but it's it looks pretty funky. It's like, I don't know. I guess it's like a bunch of little pieces, so you gotta remember where you put them or something.
Remember where you put them? Yeah. I look, man. I haven't seen that in 45 years. I don't remember. But now they wanted to make themselves look different, so they put those dots, the umlauts on top of the U's in Hüsker Dü. And right away they were kind of lumped in with the punk scene. Now they did one gig with Charlie Pine on keyboards, and that was on March 30th, 1979. Immediately after that gig, he would be fired, and they would go on as a 3-piece as Hüsker Dü. Many people, including Bob Mould, considers May 17th, 1980, at the punk club in Minneapolis called Jay's Longhorn Bar. That would be May 17th, 1980. They would consider that to be their very first gig. Now, by 1980, the band was performing regularly in Minneapolis in different punk clubs, especially that Jay's Longhorn Bar. And you could tell they had a very ferocious sound, okay, which definitely, the hardcore punk fans enjoyed, okay, but they never really considered themselves that. They weren't part of the hardcore scene per se. They played in the clubs, they played with the other bands, but they didn't really consider themselves hardcore, whatever that meant. Okay.
Yeah, well, they're definitely more like a little bit between alternative and like rock and roll. That's what pretty much they would have fit in.
Yeah, but alternative, that didn't even exist yet. That wasn't even a blip on anybody's radar. They didn't have that term yet. It just,
that's what it would have been, like post-punk, alternative. It was
post-punk is not a bad thing, not a bad term for them. But you could hear hardcore in their music too, and they did enjoy the hardcore bands that were out there. They just didn't want to pigeonhole themselves in a certain category.
I can see like Nirvana getting influenced by them, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. No, they admitted that. Nirvana admitted that. Soundgarden, even bands like Metallica.
Yeah.
Okay, we're listening to Hüsker Dü a little bit. Yeah, Kirk Hammett was a fan. Hammett. Now, they really earned their bones by touring very heavily all over the Midwest. Okay. Eventually, they caught the interest of California bands Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys, and they would do shows with them, and it opened up the whole West Coast hardcore scene to Hüsker Dü, and got them a lot of fans in that direction. Greg Ginn from Black Flag, who ran SST Records, would eventually sign them. Not quite yet, but very soon. And they would kind of have a tumultuous relationship with SST. Their first single was called Statues, had a song called Amusement as the B-side. It was released on the band's own label, which was called Reflex Records in 1981. What was happening was they were trying to shop this single around, and they couldn't get
their own label. They did their own.
They started their own small indie label called Reflex Records. They got in partnership with a guy named Terry Katzman, who was a well-known producer, record store owner, promoter in the Minneapolis area. And basically they called it Reflex Records because it was in response to the fact that they couldn't they couldn't shop their record to anybody. Nobody wanted it. Okay. SST hadn't made that offer yet to them. So they were kind of like still looking at that point. You know, the label worked also with some other local bands. So it wasn't just going to be Hüsker Dü, though mostly just them. Okay. Now, that would come out on that label. They would work on a live recording, which is actually their first full-length album. It's called Land Speed Record. So, you know, they kind of fall in that very unique category of your first record being a live record. The MC5 is another band that comes to mind that had that category too. It's not common. Even bands like Kiss, when Kiss Alive broke them, that was still like their fourth or fifth album. So it was, you know, it's rare that you have your first full record be a live album. And it was a recording that they made on August 15th, 1981 at the club called 7th Street Entry in Minneapolis. It came out in 1982, actually. The band recorded the live show on a 4-track soundboard in that club for basically $300.
Wow.
Okay, very inexpensive. But when they, well, you know, the one thing they did is they worked cheap and they worked fast. They're very much like the Ramones in that way in all their recordings. The only thing that happened was when they had the recording completed and on tape, they realized they didn't have a way to distribute it. Okay. So, I mean, they had a label they could put it out on, but somebody had to distribute it. So, the Minutemen were a band that were from the area, played around with them. Mike Watt, who was in that band, he offered to put the album out on his label, New Alliance. Okay. So he had the distribution. He had an agreement also with Jello Biafra from Dead Kennedys, his label called Alternative Tentacles. So what would happen here is New Alliance, Mike Watt's label, would put it out, and when it came to European distribution, Alternative Tentacles picked it up. Okay, in the UK mostly. So they had an album now, a live record that was released and distributed in the States by New Alliance and then by Alternative Tentacles overseas, mostly in the UK.
And you know what? The critics actually liked the album.
Every album they did.
It's incredible.
Every album they did.
It's incredible. Like when I was reading this, I was like, holy, it blew my mind. It's like, you know what? Mike, speaking, how many bands have come out from Minnesota? There have been a few bands that came out from Minnesota.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the Minutemen are one. Hüsker Dü. Oh God, there's a few more I can think of. I just have to think about it. But
from Minnesota?
What?
Was Soundgarden from Minnesota?
No, they were Seattle, right?
They were Seattle?
I think so.
But didn't they have that song, I'm Missing Minnesota or something like that?
The Replacements were from Minnesota.
The Replacements, yeah, I know that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Soundgarden, I'm not sure. Look it up. I thought they were strictly Seattle, but I could be wrong.
It might have been those guys, because that was all that whole Seattle shit that came out.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people were lumped into that, but they weren't from Seattle too. Like that Sub Pop label had Nirvana on it, you know, but they also had the Super Suckers. The Super Suckers were from Texas or Arizona.
One guy that was an American rock band formed in Seattle.
Soundgarden.
Yeah, they were formed in Seattle.
Yeah. Now I got to mention the Land Speed Record title actually has 3 different meanings. It's the band's ability to play fast. They had 17 songs in 26 minutes on this live record. Very fast.
Very fast.
Also had to do with their love for amphetamines. And the play with words as far as record, okay, meaning, you know, a record speed, or a record meaning an album. Okay. Now, New Alliance also released the band's second single called In a Free Land. The band's second album, which would be called Everything Falls Apart, would be recorded at Total Access Recording in Redondo Beach, California, between June and July of 1982. Clocking in at 19 minutes and 22 seconds for 12 songs. It was the band's first studio album with some classic 2-minute or less tracks like From the Gut. Starts off with that song. That's a great song. Blah, blah, blah. There's a punk version of Donovan's 60s song, Sunshine Superman. The record saw its release on New Alliance in January of 83. So they're pumping out already, 2 albums in a year. Yeah. Now, in 1983, in October, the band saw the release of a 7-track EP called Metal Circus. They still had their trademark hardcore punk roots with this record, this EP, but it was starting to show some signs of other, maybe more melodic influences. They were kind of like evolving and having choruses in their songs and stuff like that. There was a track called Diane that was written by Grant Hart, okay, in the band, the drummer. It was picked up by some college radio stations and got airplay. So that was kind of like their first, that was their first experience with having somewhat of a hit, kind of regional. I hadn't heard it in a long time. I was playing it yesterday. It's still a good song. Now, Bob Mould's guitar playing with this album, you could start to see that he's getting very good. Okay. It definitely showed improvement from the live stuff and a couple of singles that were out already. Now, by 83, Hüsker Dü wanted to create music outside of the confines and boundaries of hardcore. All right. Now, the next year would see them record the very ambitious double album called Zen Arcade. Yeah. Very, if you could point to probably their most important record, I would say it's this. I do kind of like the 2 records that follow Zen Arcade a little bit more. But Zen Arcade's a great record. It clocks in over an hour. Double album. Everybody should listen to the album once in their life to check it out. They recorded it, check this out, over a 45-hour period.
Yeah, that's crazy.
At the cost of $3,200. Now, you think they were high on speed or what?
I don't know, but
do it in 45 hours.
But you know what? That means they also reduced the cost. They did that one-time payment of $32. They probably save money on that. They probably made money off the
$3,200. Well, even the first Ramones record, which was recorded at Radio City Music Hall in the studio there, was for I think $6,200. And Sire Records was like in love with them for being so cheap. So for $3,200, it was even better, And it sounded good. Zen Arcade is top-notch production. Now, like I mentioned earlier, it's a concept album, kind of loosely based about a boy who leaves home and faces like a hard life ahead of him. He gets screwed over by people, and there's a girl involved, of course. There's always a girl, right? And it was very ambitious for a punk hardcore band to be doing this. And I think some people, purists, whatever, were a little turned off by it. Some of their hardcore fans. But I think the majority of the fans stayed with them. And what Zen Arcade did is
some people even compare it to Led Zeppelin, the Quantum Fusion album. They compare it to that.
The Who, the Who's Quadrophenia.
They compare it to the Who. They were trash because this is a voice, and some people were comparing it to the album.
right. Now, David Frick, who wrote for Rolling Stone, I think he still does in some capacity. one of the best rock critics ever. He called Zen Arcade the closest hardcore we'll ever get to opera. And also, he called it like a punk thrash quadrophenia, like you just mentioned. Yeah. He was the one that quoted that. Zen Arcade had a mix of different styles and influences. The guitars were definitely more melodic than anything they had ever done. Yeah. It had elements of folk music, acoustic stuff, songs like Never Talking to You Again, or even some psychedelic sounds on the song Hare Krishna. And then there's a song called Tooth Fairy and the Princess. There's piano interludes on a song or two. One Step at a Time has it. Monday Will Never Be the Same. These were concepts that were rarely, if at all, touched upon in the punk genre. Okay. If you think about punk bands, even pre-hardcore, like 77 punk bands, you know, The Clash is really the only one that comes to mind that was so ambitious like that. You know, London Calling was a double album. Okay. Sandinista was a triple album. Nobody was really doing that. And that was just all different styles. Okay. Hüsker Dü was a little more consistent with Zen Arcade.
But there was a problem with the album, Mike.
Yeah. I was just going to say they were very frustrated. SST was the label that put it out. Okay, they were signed with SST at that point, and it turned out that they were Greg Ginn and SST were very cautious as to how many records they would print up. Okay, they would get made. They made between 3,500 and 5,000, but it turned out to not be enough. And there were shortages right off the bat. They had a hit on their hands and they couldn't do anything with it. That's happened one too many times in music. You know, I know it happened to Johnny Thunders when his album came out. But it was a mistake, and they had to pay for it, unfortunately, because people wanted to buy the record and they couldn't find it. And this was before the internet. Okay, so now immediately in between an excessive touring schedule, Hüsker Dü started recording a follow-up to New Day, which was called New Day Rising. They recorded in July of 1984, and it got released in January of 85. New Day Rising was a continuation away from the hardcore punk sound that they had started with to more melodic music, but Hüsker Dü had wanted to produce it themselves. That was the main sticking point with them. Yeah. SST wouldn't let them do it, and they used their house producer Spot, okay, who did a lot of work for Black Flag and other bands. It created a very tense recording session for that month, okay, but it landed a great record. Okay, I think it's one of their best. New Day Rising. It kind of like
these guys made records after record. Like they were pumping out records. That's amazing.
Very prolific. Yeah, very prolific. Bob Mould and Grant Hart were writing the songs. Norton didn't really write too much. He wrote a little bit.
Do you think bands like that they take out so many records, they only last like 10 years? You think like by 10 years they just burned out because they're like being together, touring? That's like tough, man.
Yeah, you know, when you look back in hindsight at certain bands and you go, well, you know, why'd you put out 2 records a year when you could have put 1 out a year or 1 out every 2 years? But then you get into those other things where you're waiting for a band to put something out. That's not good either. So I don't know. You know, I don't know. I think I kind of lean towards how they did it, where you just keep pumping it out and hope you get that hit, you know, because they were like right there, you know, they were real close. And now this album again would be critically acclaimed. The critics love New Day Rising. The single that was released off it was called Celebrated Summer. and also the title track, New Day Rising, was a single. And again, they would immediately start working on a new album in 1985. And that would be called Flip Your Wig. Okay. Another great record. Now, that got released in September of 85, and it would become their best-selling album to that point. SST, with Hüsker Dü on board, Hüsker Dü was their best-selling band.
Yeah.
Better than even Black Flag. Okay, at that point. And finally,
the first one on that CMJ, right? The independent label.
CMJ, that was wasn't the CMJ like that?
Flip Your Wig album that was released in the independent record label to top the CMJ album chart. So that one,
they used to be CMJ festivals. I don't know if you remember this. I do very well because they used to play the Continental all the time. If you had a CMJ festival was when all the underground bands were coming into town, and if they were part of that festival, they would be playing different clubs in the city. The Continental Divide on 3rd Avenue was a spot that always had CMJ festival bands. Others would do it. Okay. It was kind of like a underground music festival. Remember, there was no internet. There was no way to know about what was going on with some of these bands. So they would have these festivals to showcase. And if you got into the CMJ, which Hüsker Dü did, okay, and other bands got into it, you would get some recognition. You would get some press. The press would be writing about it. Yeah, and that was, if you got on the CMJ tour, that was a big thing for your band. It was a way to promote it. When they were doing Flip Your Wig, they were finally allowed to produce themselves entirely. Okay. And they did spend between March and June of 1985, which was a long time for them to be in the studio. 3 months. That was the longest they had ever been. They wanted to have a very high quality production. This record's a little more power pop oriented in some ways, though it still has that heavy guitar distortion. But what was starting to happen is Mould was starting to kind of take over a little bit. It would get worse later. I'll get more into it. He was writing about half the albums at that point. Grant Hart was writing the other half, or they would co-write things together. One single they put out on Flip Your Wig, which is one of their most famous songs, is Makes No Sense at All. You played it earlier. And that had the B-side of the Mary Tyler Moore theme song, Love Is All Around. Yeah. Okay. So they did a great version of that. They also recorded their first official video for Makes No Sense at All. And that would get played on MTV.
Yep.
The song also Makes No Sense at All, got some airplay, even on like regular radio stations that would play rock, maybe classic rock or play regular rock and roll when you still had that on the radio. By the year's end in 1985, with 2 groundbreaking albums released in that same year, Hüsker Dü was starting to get noticed. Yeah. Both albums were ranked in the top 10 that year by the Village Voice. Okay. So in their top 10, the Village Voice's top 10, 2 albums in the top 10 were Hüsker Dü. So they were getting recognized.
Mike, you want to crazy? How crazy is it that these guys would go to promote the albums and they didn't have albums to sign to give to the public?
SST always had a distribution problem with them. It would start with Zen Arcade and continue with New Day Rising and Flip Your Wig. It was a frustration that the band had, and they would leave. Okay, they would leave very soon after Flip Your Wig came out. Warner Brothers, when they were recording that record, approached the band
Oh,
and
shit.
they wanted to put out Flip Your Wig, but Hüsker Dü said no, we're going to put it out on SST, and then Warner's said to them, listen, come with us on your next record. We'll give you complete creative control.
Wow. That's huge.
Okay. And, you know, they had the Warner Brothers distribution. It was huge. You're not going to have these problems anymore, you know?
No.
So they would, you know, they would jump ship. All right. And, you know, I think it, you know, I don't know all the details. I've heard stories. I think, you know, it created a rift between SST and Greg Ginn, Black Flag, and Hüsker Dü. You know, it was like, I don't know if they ever, I mean, there would be legal battles later on with the band and SST over the years to kind of untangle all this shit. You know, I don't get into it too much in this podcast, but the things did happen that had to do with money and stuff they felt owed and all that stuff. Okay.
But Mike, you got some great albums that came out by these guys, right?
Yeah.
And they distribute, so they just make 5,000 albums. You got like millions of people that want to hear that. You only fucking make 5,000 albums? That's a fucking slap in the face.
It is. Now, I don't know if that's 5,000 was maybe the max that they could handle as a label. Warner Brothers wasn't going to have that problem, so they were gone. You know, there was no way they were staying with SST.
Let me ask you a question. Was the signed the contract with Warner Brothers? Could they bring their albums over and have them press more, or does SST?
Well, that's, you know, you could if you had the rights. Okay. I don't think they did at that point.
All right.
The entire Hüsker Dü catalog's been released and re-released several times over the years. SST has put stuff out, and Warner Brothers too. So there must be some, you know, collaboration now, 30 years later, you know. But their fifth album, which will be their first with Warner Brothers, will be called Candy Apple Gray. Now, it was recorded between October of 85 and January of 86, and officially came out on March 17th, 1986. It would kind of be the completion of their transition away from hardcore to a more like well-rounded sonic style with like you know, a lot of distorted guitars, but definitely not really a hardcore punk sound anymore. Very unique what they were sounding like at that point. It's also at this point too that you started hearing the references to calling them alternative rock or college rock. That was like 1986, 87 time. Now, the singles off this record was Sorry Somehow and Don't Want to Know If You Are Lonely, which is one of their famous songs. Popular MTV video existed for that song. And at this point, this would be their biggest selling album, peaking at number 140 in the top 200.
That's amazing.
So they're getting it. You know, they're just almost breaking. They're getting played a little bit on the radio, getting played a little bit on MTV, a little bit. But they would never kind of get over that hump. You know what I mean? They kind of, if they had existed 10 years later, they would have been huge, I think.
But I also think that once they reach that hump, that's when tension starts, stress, and a lot more stuff start happening.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, they were having problems, okay? Which I'll get into in a little bit. They were very private guys, but there was stuff that was going on, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, actually, I'll get into it right now. You know, all wasn't well, like we're saying, even though they were at their commercial peak.
Yeah.
Bob Mould and Grant Hart would clash on the direction of the band. Okay, that was a thing that they fought back and forth between Hart and Mould. What direction were we going to go? Mould had made a comment publicly about Grant Hart, saying that he would never let him have more than half a Hüsker Dü record. Okay, in other words, he would only be allowed to write at the most half a record. Now, other tensions also got involved because they fired their longtime manager, David Savoy,
Yeah.
and Bob Mould took over all the managerial duties, which kind of gave him full reign in the band, and that became a problem. And also, Norton was complaining that his songs weren't getting paid attention to. So, Hüsker Dü began working again. They were constantly working on a sixth record.
You know that David, the manager, committed suicide.
Yeah, eventually he did. Yes. Yes. Don't know exactly all the details of that, but I don't know. He did, did you get any details on that or no?
What they're saying is at the eve of the band's manager do it following that Mould began assuming that most of the band's management doing the following the suicide of the manager Dave on the eve of the band's 1987 tour to support the double album Warehouse Songs and Stories.
Yeah, that would be the one coming up. Okay, but I believe they had already let him go. Okay. And I guess he had a lot of problems and he took it hard and he committed suicide, I guess.
Crazy.
Yeah, now this would be their sixth and final record, Warehouse Songs and Stories. Another double album like Zen Arcade. The track Could You Be the One was released as the first single and video. And just to mention, they never released a single off of Zen Arcade. Interesting enough. They wanted to keep it as you buy it, listen to it as a whole. They didn't do that with this. This was a double album, Warehouse Songs and Stories as well, but they didn't do that. They released Could You Be the One as a single. They also released She's a Woman and Now He Is a Man. That's the name of that song. And also the song Ice Cold Ice. And those three singles helped propel the album to number 117, which was their best-selling record. Okay. They also did an interview and performance on The Late Show with Joan Rivers on April 27th, 1987. I remember seeing that. I can still remember watching that because they were going to be on.
And the Today Show also.
Right. They also did the Today Show around that time. Now, this album, Warehouse Songs and Stories, would be their, best-selling record. But in my opinion, it probably should have been a single record. I think it would have been even better. Okay. It's just as a double album, there's a little too much filler on there. Zen Arcade was not like that. Zen Arcade was solid all the way, but I think they were probably on a downward, spiral with their songwriting by this point. Still a good record, not a bad record, but it's just not their best. Now, they would fall apart on the tour of this album. Okay, they went out to support the album on tour. And what was happening was not only did we have these tensions in the band we just talked about with the songwriting, but there was also drug use going on. Grant Hart had developed a bad heroin habit that he was trying to kick. Bob Mould had stopped drinking. He was a lifelong drinker up to that point. Norton was recently married and was getting into the restaurant business and starting to go in different directions. What would happen is they would have a gig lined up in Columbia, Missouri. And Grant Hart was dealing with his heroin withdrawals by taking methadone. And right before the gig, he was going to take some, and the bottle broke. So we had to do the show like all junk sick, okay? And they didn't know if he was going to finish the show. Now, he did finish the show, okay? Well, what would happen is Bob Mould canceled the rest of the tour, okay? And basically, Hart would quit the band 4 days later. And Bob Mould has often said that it really wasn't so much what you were hearing. It was more about like three guys go in separate directions. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, January 26th of 1988, the band would officially break up. They would announce it at that point. And, you know, over the next few years, there will be, you know, some different situations where Hart and Mould would play. Bob Mould started a band called Sugar. Okay. Now, in 1997, 6 years after the release of, I should say 1997, 6 years after their breakup, nine years, I'm sorry, after their breakup, Warner Brothers came out with a live record, and it's called The Living End. And it's an interesting live record because it's all taken from that last tour in 1987, a couple of different shows, but the song list is kind of like from their whole career.
Yeah.
So you're catching, it's almost like a greatest hits done live in that one tour. Okay.
You know because they needed one more album.
Yeah. They had to put it out. Usually a deal is 3 albums.
Yeah. So that's why I figured that's why they did that. The Living
Yeah, they
Dead.
had to put it out.
Yeah.
Now, the liner notes for this record was written by David Frick, who was still a fan of the band. He actually talks about the breakup and stuff and what happened with them on these liner notes. Bob Mould is on record saying he's never listened to this record. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that's still true or not, but he says he's never listened to it. Like I said, he would go on to start a band called Sugar, which were pretty good. He also started a band called the Nova Mob. He had several solo efforts. Greg Norton went into the restaurant business for a while and would get back into music around 2006 in a band called the Gang Front. Grant Hart had various projects over the years. Sometimes that involved Bob Mould in certain benefit events and things like that. But he would pass away, Grant Hart, on September 14th, 2017, of liver cancer at the age of 56. Bob Mould is around today. He did put something out recently in the last year. I did catch a song that wasn't bad. But he's a prolific songwriter, great songwriter, transcended the whole punk scene beyond what they were doing. So that's your Hüsker Dü episode, my man.
Wow, man, what a history, man! Like, but damn, they were for 10 years. They were a busy freaking band, man. Like,
oh yeah,
wow,
yep.
They were playing every day. They had albums after album, and they left a legacy that how can you follow up that legacy? Like, pretty amazing. Like, such a band and such a legacy.
Yeah, and influential too. I think that a lot of bands, like I said, from the early 90s and into the late 90s, anybody playing what was considered alternative music owed something to them. You know, they really kind of like opened people's eyes to more underground music. It was always cool when 120 Minutes on MTV would play a Hüsker Dü song in between some of the other stuff that wasn't that good. You know, It was kind of like, oh, wow, these guys are still out there, you know. Yeah. So I got to see them once. It was on the Candy Apple Gray tour, and they were very good.
Yeah.
They were, they're just they sounded like the records, which is what you want to hear.
Yeah, but you know what's amazing about that? Not every record was the same, because the music evolved. Like every album, it will evolve into. By the end, it was what it was, you know.
Yeah, well, they were unique. They were working in the punk genre, but they did not want to be pigeonholed into that. And you would hear things like, you'd hear pianos, you'd hear some kind of instrument that you might not hear in punk rock, in what they were doing. But very original band. I dig them. Everybody should check them out. Sugar was a good band as well that Bob Mould had. I think they had about 2 albums. I could be wrong. I think about 2. And then he's done solo stuff that's decent as well. So Sadly, Grant Hart is not around, so we'll never have a Hüsker Dü reunion. But
Yeah,
I think had he lived, they probably would have.
You think? Yeah, I was saying if they were alive, they probably would have reunited.
Oh, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you know what, people would love to hear something like that now.
Oh yeah, I mean, you look at what's popular in music now. What's selling is old music.
Yeah.
You know, and some people have asked me, oh, Mike, why don't you talk about, something more up to date? And I old music is outselling new music.
Yeah.
So I figure I'm on point by talking about this stuff because, all right, maybe you don't know a lot about Hüsker Dü, but I could see someone watching this show and getting Zen Arcade and that being a mind-blowing moment, because it is that kind of record that when you listen to it, you go, oh, this is not just, Ramones influenced punk hardcore. This is something more going on here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's it.
And next week we got the rest of for November, what a schedule. We got the replacement. We got the making of the Full Kiss solo album. The Beach Boy and Buddy
Holly. Buddy Holly at the end of the month. Yeah. It's gonna be a good month. November's gonna be a good month. Hopefully we get a guest for that replacement show. Hopefully.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward for the Full Kiss album, so we can shit on this.
Oh yeah, we're gonna shit on some of them, yeah, because they're not all good. In case you don't know.
All right. So how can people reach you?
Okay, you can find me on Instagram, RockerMike212, RockerMike212. You can find me on Clout Hub and MeWe as RockerMike. You can find me on Facebook as RockoMike. And, of course, on the Rockshow podcast group page on Facebook, where we talk about all this good stuff here. How about you, Rob?
And you can find me on anything Getting Lumped Up. And if you look up Getting Lumped Up on Google, anything, I'm the first thing that popped up. But I also want to tell everybody that our program is changing a little bit for the new year.
Yeah.
The show will be every other week, because we're doing some more interesting conspiracy. So 1 week we're gonna have a rock show. The following week can be a conspiracy show, and then another rock show. Because we're just changing the schedule a little bit to keep people off their feet and keep the the whole channel interesting. Because we got a lot of questions. We got a lot of reading a lot of strange books. Because we're gonna have a hell of a show for you with the conspiracy.
Yeah, we're gonna emphasize the conspiracy 420 shows a little more starting next year.
Yeah.
But don't worry, the rock show's still gonna be on every other week now instead of every week. But we'll still be talking about new and interesting bands maybe you never heard of. I got a few lined up. I'm gonna make a new list definitely soon.
Oh, you can start bringing up concerts dates since we have concerts again. You can doing who's playing soon because
yeah. I mean, there is some concerts I've heard about that are scheduled starting, in October, November, December, and all that. So yeah, I'll keep people up to date on that.
Because they're definitely playing like a lot of Forest Hill, Steel. Terminal 5, everybody's getting show. They didn't Cheap Trick just played not too long ago, and I think
Cheap Trick played Irving Plaza back in September.
Yeah.
And our buddy Sean Harris, who's doing a couple of shows with us, he was there, and I got to see some clips from it. Everybody singing "Surrender." That was pretty cool. That was they were playing the night that we did the Jack Davidson interview.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they were playing that night, and we were lumped up in Johnny's. We weren't going nowhere that night.
Oh man, what a night.
Oh yeah, I started in Nassau Bar and ended up in Johnny's.
All right, Mike. So let's end this fine programming, this excellent program with Don't Get Drunk.
Get lumped up, people.
See you next week.
Take care.
and it's only here on the Rock Show. Ooh, yeah, on the Rock Show. Ooh, yeah, on the Rock Show. So tell your friends and everyone you know. Let's get lumped up on the Rock Show.